Okay, let's talk about work backwards problems. So one thing you're going to be expected to do is be able to identify what quadrant you're in. And there are some problems like this on the test we're going to take, and there's some of these on the review packet. So if you're given the condition, sine is greater than zero, tan's less than zero, you think to yourself, well, sine is greater than zero in the first and second quadrant, AKA it's positive, tangent's less than zero, negative, tangent's negative in the second and fourth quadrant. So when do they overlap? Second quadrant. So that only happens in the second quadrant. Cosine's less than zero, cosecant's greater than zero. Let me see, cosine's less than zero in the second and third. Cosine's greater than zero. Cosecant's greater than zero in the first and second. So it looks like second quadrant is the overlap here also. Cotan's negative in the second and fourth, secant's negative in the second and third. So all three of those turned out to be second quadrant, but that's just a fluke. I didn't mean for that to happen. Okay, then when you get to the actual problems, these are actual problems, and these are on the test, and they're in the review guide, et cetera, et cetera. You get something like this, and you say to yourself, all right, sine equals to 1/2. Hopefully at this point of the show, you're going to say to yourself, oh, sine equals to 1/2 at the 30s. So we know that we're dealing with the 30s, or the 30s are also the pi over 6s. So whenever you see that sine's 1/2, you know your reference is a 30 or pi over 6. So I'm just doing radians and degrees because we need to start brainwashing ourselves to think both. Then you say to yourself, okay, sine equals to positive 1/2. So sine is positive, first or second. Cosine's negative, cosine's less than zero, so it's negative, second or third. So we're dealing with the second quadrant angle again. I didn't mean for it's all these second quadrant angles coming up. That's just a fluke. So you say, okay, so I need the second quadrant angle that has 30 as a reference. Well, that's 150. I need the second quadrant angle that has pi over 6 as a reference. Well, that's 5 pi over 6. See what I'm saying? That's no big deal. So then we get over here. Oh, we made the conditions a little bit goofier. Made the conditions just a little bit goofier. We say, let me see, between pi over 2 and 3 pi over 2 would be here. So we know we're only dealing with the second or third quadrant. So I'm in the second or third quadrant. When is tan negative? Let me see, tan is negative in the second and fourth. So my answer here has to be, golly, second quadrant again. Okay, this is just a fluke that all these are second quadrant. So it turns out to be second quadrant again. Then you got to say to yourself, well, when does tan get positive or negative 1? Well, if you think about it, if you don't have it memorized, or you can think about an easy way to remember, well, in order for tan to be 1, sine and cosine have to be the same. X and Y have to be the same. Therefore, sine and cosine have to be the same. So if tan is 1, the only time sine and cosine are the same is at the 45s. So we know we're dealing with the 45s here, which in radians is pi over 4. And then we would say to ourselves, oh, in the second quadrant, the pi over 4s are 135 and 3 pi over 4. Right. Not too big of a deal. Let me see. This one we're going to 270. So this one's a little weirder because 270 is down here. So we're really talking about first, second, or third quadrant. We're restricting it to first, second, or third. Let's see. Secant is negative, which only happens in the second and third quadrant. So that could be either of them. Cotan's negative, which happens in the second and fourth quadrant. So we got second quadrant. What? Oh, what am I doing here? Cotan's positive. Cotan's positive. Sorry, I wasn't looking carefully enough. Cotan is positive. Cotan's greater than 0, which is first and third. So we're dealing with the first and third quadrant. Cotan's positive, first and third. Secant's negative, second and third. So we're dealing with the third quadrant angle here. Then it gets, a little tricky. You say, oh no, when does secant get this funky -2√3/3? Well, that negative 2 root 3 over 3 only happens when you start out with a root 3 over 2. So the reciprocal of secant is cosine. So you can say to yourself, well, when does cosine get the root 3 over 2? Well, the root 3 over 2 is always paired with the 1/2. So cosine would equal to that when sine is 1/2, and sine is 1/2 at the 30s. Or, like I've said before, you can always just draw a triangle if you don't remember. So you can always draw your triangle, your 30, 60, and say 1, 2, root 3. When does cosine, when would cosine be root 3 over 2? Well, cosine of 60 is 1 over 2. That didn't help. Cosine of 30 is root 3 over 2. Oh, so that makes it the 30s. Once again, we know we're dealing with third quadrant here. So in the third quadrant, wait a second, I just messed up. Did I mess up? I didn't mess up. That's right. Secant is a reciprocal of cosine, right? Secant's reciprocal of cosine. So therefore cosine is root 3 over 2. That happens at the 30s. Yeah, I'm doing this right. So in the third quadrant, that's 210. In the third quadrant, that's 7 pi over 6. Okay. So anyway, this takes a lot of thought. Obviously, I'm having to think about it. We need to move on. All right, so let's look at a slightly different situation here. What about something like this? 0 to 4 pi, 0 to 4 pi. Well, that's, let me see, that's 2 pi. Wait a second. That's 2 laps around the circle. So here's what makes this tricky. This is 2 laps around the circle. So it's going to be just a little bit trickier. Cosecant is undefined. So here's what you got to say to yourself. And we've talked about this. When do you get undefined? We only get undefined at the quadrantals. Cosecant undefined, let me see. If cosecant is undefined, then sine must be 0. The reciprocal of undefined. And you say, well, sine is 0 and y is 0. Well, y is 0 at these guys. Okay, sine is 0 at these guys. The x-axis, that's when sine is 0. So let me see, we're going around the circle. So we've got, oh, and I forgot to write both of them. Oh, so you're on an axis. First thing is, you know, you're on an axis. So there's no reference. Second is you're going to say, all right, well, that's 0. That's 180. That's 360. Oh no, but we got to go 2 laps. So what is that? 540. Wait a second. I said to do it in pi. I specifically said on the answer here to do it in terms of pi. So that would be 0 pi, 2 pi, 3 pi, and then 4 pi. Somebody says, well, why did you include the 4 pi? Because it does say or equal here. If it didn't say or equal, I wouldn't put the 4 pi. So that's 0 pi, 2 pi, 3 pi, 4 pi, because we had to go 2 laps. And sometimes these have multiple solutions. And if I wanted to, I could do it in degrees if I wanted to take the time to answer all this carefully. All right, let's talk about one of these guys. Because once again, it's the quadrants that are the situation. Let me see, sine is negative, cotan's negative. When does that happen? When is sine negative and cotan negative? When is sine negative and cotan negative? When are sine and cotan both negative? Let me see, sine is negative. I just drew that wrong. I was thinking of the wrong quadrant. Sine is negative in the third and fourth quadrant. Cotan's negative in the second and fourth quadrant. So you're going to think, okay, sine's negative, third and fourth, cotan's negative in second and fourth. So it looks like we're in the fourth quadrant. So we have to draw our angle in the fourth quadrant. And I know this is the reference angle, but this is what we refer to, isn't it? So sine would be -3, 5. So we do a little Pythagorean theorem and our missing side is 4. Does that seem logical? So then we can just put the pieces together. So and I know it says you're saying, but it's the reference. But remember, we use the reference angle to make the triangle that goes with the actual angle. I realize our actual angle could be this guy, or somebody says, well, your actual angle could be negative, whatever this is. Could be positive this, could be negative this. But we use the reference angle to actually make the triangles. So the cosine would be 4/5. Tangent would be -3/4. The cosecant, just flip that guy. That was easy enough. Secant, start flipping. 5/4. Cosecant, 4/3. Okay. Anyways, that's the last bunch of new material for this test. We will spend a lot of time on it in class.